So we are in Module 13, which is our last module for this final week of the class. We'll be covering Chapter 14, which is heart disease, stroke, cancer, and AIDS. Last module we talked a little bit about cancer because I had you guys watch the cancer video, which was really not so much about the cancer as it was about the type of group that the women were in to support their experience through cancer treatment. So I'm hoping that you can take that and apply it then as well to this chapter, as we'll be kind of looking a little more in depth at cancer and what its treatment is like. So let's dive into the objectives really quickly. You have a good idea now about chronic illness and dealing with chronic illness. And this chapter really looks at some different types of chronic illnesses that the last chapter did not. And the reason why it puts it in sort of their own category is because these are some of the bigger heavy hitters in terms of, numbers wise, what is affecting people today. So they really kind of get their own dedicated chapter, if you will. Now we'll be looking at, first off, heart disease. And this is something that's come up throughout the course, definitely in other chapters. We've sort of touched on it when we talked about eating and diet and how that's related to heart health. You guys have covered the cardiovascular system. Back in chapter 2, we looked at the physiology of the heart and how the heart's affected by stress. So you have a good idea already about some of that. We'll be looking at a little more in depth at the relationship between negative emotions and heart disease, which I think you got some of that back from when we watched the stress video, and just how stress can affect the heart. And stress is definitely a negative emotion. We'll also be looking at things like anger, type A personality, one that's very angry, competitive, and even aggressive. We'll look at what's involved in medical treatment and rehabilitation of cardiac patients, as well as what's the psychosocial impact of heart disease on an individual's work and family relationships. So kind of touching on some of what we just covered in the last chapter. Then we'll get into stroke, the key factors of stroke, who's at risk for stroke, as well as explaining some of the biological and lifestyle factors related to stroke. If we take a look at stroke in and of itself, we tend to hear more about the biological elements of it. Physiologically, what happens when someone has a stroke. We don't hear much about is, what happens after. After someone has suffered a stroke, what is their life like? How does it change? So that's really important. Definitely some serious impairments that occur with stroke victims. And then coping really becomes the major strategy of how to live after having a stroke. So we'll discuss the emotional, occupational, and social effects of stroke. Then we will get into cancer, looking at the prevalence, some statistics in terms of rates and types, and how age and gender and social cultural factors all play a role in cancer. And then we'll take a look at some ways of recognizing and dealing with cancer, as well as some diagnoses. A lot of terms are thrown around when we hear the word cancer. For many people, it evokes not good images. And we hear lots of big medical terminology used when we talk about cancer. And some of you may be familiar with some of that, and some of you not. So we'll be kind of going through a lot of that, looking at the decisions patients have to make when they're undergoing treatment. There's many options often today for the treatment of cancer, depending upon what type you have and how advanced it is, what stage it's at. But all of that's going to go ahead and involve recurrence, adjustment, emotional issues, social support. So we'll take a look at really an all-encompassing psychosocial intervention and how that's used to treat cancer. And here's where those support groups really come into play and can be key in a type of psychosocial intervention that's actually adding on years to a person's life who's diagnosed with cancer. Helping that person live to the fullest, to the best of their ability with the time that they have left is sometimes the best that a person can hope for, especially when they're diagnosed with a terminal illness or terminal cancer. So that will wrap up the cancer coverage, and then we will move into talking about HIV and AIDS. First off, understanding the difference between the two really is just a matter of the stage and state at which a person is at. And then we'll look at, really want to spend some time looking at risk factors involved, dispelling some of the common myths that exist today in terms of HIV and AIDS and how it's spread and who is at risk. It's changed, excuse me, over the last few decades, really the past 2 decades. It's the face of HIV and AIDS has really drastically changed. So we'll talk about prevalence and incidence of AIDS, and then as well how HIV progresses to AIDS, which is important. And then lastly, looking at a typical AIDS regimen. What's it like for a person living with AIDS? Adherence is really tough. Why is that? And what types of interventions are being used to target a better treatment plan for someone with AIDS? So here are the lecture slides, and then you have your last video that goes along with the chapter, and this one is on HIV and AIDS. It's called Undetectable, and it's following the lives of 6 individuals, all of whom have AIDS or HIV, and you'll learn how they each contracted it, and they are all taking a specific drug regimen called the HART regimen and protease inhibitors, which are basically drugs that are helping to fill in for the immune system where it can't do its own job, helping to get a handle on the virus that's in the body and hopefully make it undetectable. So when you have HIV and AIDS, you can actually see in numbers and count how much of the virus is in your body by how it's interacting with your white blood cells and how it's affecting the immune system. And when you have the virus at an undetectable level, basically the virus is in your body, but it's not wreaking havoc. It's manageable, and the person is living the best that they can, and that's the goal. Once you have HIV and AIDS, you'll never get rid of it, at least not as of yet with today's modern medicine. And so the goal is to maintain the virus and keep it sort of at bay, keep it from wreaking havoc on the body. But the drug regimen is really tough and very can be just as bad, if not maybe sometimes worse than the actual virus itself in terms of the toll it takes on the body. So you'll be watching the video and then completing the video worksheet on that. And that will wrap that up. And then you have Module 13 discussion, deals with risk from health-harming chronic stress. So you'll each be taking a look at your chronic stress levels, taking a look at some of the termites who were under a good deal of chronic stress. Some of them went through war. If you think about the termites, this study was going on during World War II, during the Vietnam War, during the Korean War. So we have a pretty large pool of data that can look at war and stress, which I think is super interesting. And then as well, looking at the links between depression and heart disease. And remember, this is longitudinal data. So looking at over the lifespan of the same individuals, what kinds of links did we see between a mental state like depression and heart disease? Dr. Friedman talks a little bit about the disease-prone personality and what that means, looking at the interaction of stress and genes. And then we'll kind of piggyback on the diathesis stress model, which was talked about earlier in the stress chapters that we covered. And then finally, just thinking about how you handle your own stress and whether or not that's beneficial for you. And some of you, unfortunately, may have been through something really traumatic already in your lives. And so if that's the case, be thinking about that. Kind of forcing yourself to assess and evaluate how you handle that trauma as a challenge. Okay, and then that's going to wrap up the book. You guys are going to be done with the longevity project. And we have an exam 4. It's your last exam, covering chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14. And I just want to remind everybody really quickly that this is a shortened week. So we end on Friday. The class ends Friday. So you don't have until Sunday like normal. So it's a shorter week, which means you kind of got to work harder in this last week to accomplish everything, to get those discussions in, the video worksheets in, and then the exam completed. So just be aware of the timeline, be aware of the due dates, and then you should be all set. But if you have any questions as you're going through this last week, please feel free to email me. You guys have been a really good class. I've enjoyed the discussion. I think this was one of the best classes I've had actually online in terms of discussion. I mean, you guys were really integrating in the readings, and I loved seeing that. And as well, putting your own spin on things and relating the readings to personal experience, which I always think is great when you're able to do that. But just a good class overall, and wherever you're headed next, whether you're at Westfield or you're moving on or you're at another school, I wish you all the best. I hope for success for you, and hopefully that you enjoyed the class. So again, please email me if you have any concluding thoughts or questions, and I'd be happy to answer those. All right, thanks everyone.